For those of you who are always on the go, remember mindful moments.
Bite-sized knowledge, right?
Exactly. Perfect for those mental snacks throughout the day. Narrated by AI, too. What if, like everything we think we know about the Cold War, what if it's only like one side of the story? Like, what if that whole global superpower battle, what if that's hiding something way darker, something way more brutal?
Well, that's kind of the disturbing question that Vincent Bevins asks in the Jakarta Method, right? I mean, this book, it really challenges how we usually see the Cold War, by showing us all this anti-communist violence that, like, exploded across the global south. And a lot of times the U.S. was, like, quietly approving it, even supporting it.
Yeah, it's a huge shift in perspective, especially for people who like grew up thinking the Cold War was, mostly just an ideological thing. Bevins, he makes us face the real cost of this whole conflict. And like we're talking millions of lives lost all across Asia, Africa, Latin America.
Right. And the thing that makes this book so powerful is that it goes beyond just like listing all these awful things that happen.
Mm.
Bevins, he uncovers a pattern, almost like a method to the violence. And it all started in Indonesia. And then it was like exported, copied all
Yeah.
over the world.
Okay, so like let's get into this. We're talking about the world in 1945, right? A time of massive change. Former colonies in Asia, Africa, Latin America, they're all declaring independence, figuring out their own paths.
Exactly. And you've got this wave of decolonization happening at the same time that the U.S. is getting more and more scared of communism. Guys like Frank Wisner, a really important figure in the
Yeah.
brand new CIA at the time, they saw any movement, even if it just hinted at socialism or leftist ideas, they saw it as a direct threat to the U.S.
And it wasn't just talk, right? I mean, Bevins points to those early U.S. interventions, like in Iran in 53 and Guatemala in 54, where the CIA helped overthrow democratically elected governments.
Yeah, those interventions, they set a really dangerous precedent, They showed that the U.S. was willing to use these covert operations, even straight up force, to get rid of any government they saw as a threat. Didn't matter if it was legitimate or if the people actually supported it.
And at the same time, you've got this rise of the Third World movement, all these newly independent countries looking for a way forward that wasn't aligned with the U.S. or the Soviet Union.
Yeah, the Bandung Conference in 1955 was a big deal for this movement. Leaders from all over Asia and Africa came together to say, hey, we're independent and we're going to forge our own path. Figures like Sukarno from Indonesia, they really embodied that spirit of non-alignment.
But, like Bevins argues, the U.S. often saw this non-alignment thing as a threat in itself. And that brings us to Indonesia, the country Bevins uses as like this chilling case study to show how this anti-communist violence actually worked.
Right, Indonesia under Sukarno, he was really charismatic and they were trying to find their own way, balancing things with both the US and the Soviet Union. And then you've got the Indonesian Communist Party, the PKI. They were gaining a lot of support, like really grassroots stuff.
So you've got Sukarno doing his own thing and the PKI getting more and more popular. That must have set off alarm bells in Washington.
Oh, absolutely. And it led to all these covert operations trying to destabilize Sukarno's government and weaken the PKI. Which brings us to September 30th, 1965, a date that completely changed Indonesia's history.
6 Indonesian generals were killed. Nobody really knows how it happened, but the chaos afterwards gave General Suharto, a guy the CIA was already kind of cozy with, the chance to take power.
Suharto's rise was fast and brutal. He was really good at using the situation, blaming the PKI for the killings, starting this whole propaganda campaign that made people terrified of communists. Like, he created this atmosphere of fear and paranoia.
It's hard to even imagine how much violence came after that. Bevins thinks somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people were killed in Indonesia between 1965 and 1966.
And what's really messed up is how much the U.S. was involved. Bevins has all this evidence, declassified documents, people's firsthand accounts. The U.S., they gave the Indonesian military lists of suspected communists. They encouraged the killings. They even, celebrated how successful Suharto was in crushing the PKI.
And that's where the term Jakarta Method comes from, right? This organized massacre, the U.S. knew about it, supported it, and it became this horrible blueprint for anti-communist violence, and it would be copied all over the world.
It's a really sobering thought. And, if you're interested in going even deeper into this kind of historical analysis, trying to find these hidden narratives, there's this YouTube channel called Mindful Moments. They use AI to break down complex ideas from audiobooks. They don't just focus on the Cold War, but they offer this really interesting way to look at historical revisionism and how these narratives, how they can be shaped and changed over time.
It definitely reminds you that history is often written by the winners. And it's so important to look for those different perspectives if you want to really understand how complex the past really was.
Absolutely. The Jakarta Method is a perfect example of how a dominant narrative can hide a much darker, much more brutal truth. And when we understand how this method started and how it spread, we can start to understand the massive impact it had on the global south, politically, I mean.
So let's shift our focus now to Latin America. Let's see how these echoes of the Jakarta Method, how they played out in places like Brazil and Chile.
Yeah, Brazil in 1964, that's a perfect example. President Goulart, he was trying to do all these things, reduce inequality, make Brazil more independent. But the U.S., they thought he was way too leftist.
And it's like the Jakarta Method all over again, right?
Mm-hmm.
A coup backed by the U.S., all this Cold War paranoia, fear of communists taking over, and Goulart's out. They put in a military dictatorship.
Bevins really argues that the Brazilian coup, it was like they took the lessons from Indonesia and applied them directly. It's the same playbook. Make the leftist leaders look bad, get people scared of communism, use the military to grab power.
And then you have Chile, man. Such a fascinating story, but also really tragic. I mean, right before the coup against Allende in 73, people were writing, "Jakarta's is coming," on walls all over Santiago. Allende was a socialist, but he was democratically elected.
And that graffiti, it wasn't just some empty threat, It shows that people knew what was about to happen. It was like a chilling prediction of the violence that was coming to Chile. And the U.S., again, they played a huge role in bringing Allende down, clearing the way for Pinochet's dictatorship, which was, incredibly brutal.
Bevins, he connects all the dots, showing how the Jakarta Method influenced the Chilean coup. It's hard to deny the similarities, the U.S. backing Pinochet, the wave of repression and violence against anyone they thought might be a communist.
And it wasn't limited to Brazil and Chile. Bevins shows how the Jakarta Method, or versions of it, it was used in at least 11 countries in Latin America. We're talking about countless deaths, people disappearing, a legacy of trauma that these countries are still dealing with today.
Yeah, Operation Condor, man, that was rough. A bunch of South American dictatorships working together, this whole campaign of repression and assassinations. It's like the Jakarta Method in its most terrifying form.
What's really scary about Operation Condor is how organized it was. These regimes, they shared information, resources, even prisoners. And the U.S., they knew about it, and they supported it.
It's a dark picture of the Cold War. Way more complicated than the simple stories we usually hear.
Yeah.
Bevins, he makes us face this really uncomfortable truth that a lot of times winning this ideological battle meant that a lot of people had to suffer and die.
The implications are really huge, and they reach far beyond just that time period. Bevins argues that crushing these other ways of doing things, these alternative models for development and politics and economics in the global south, it's had a direct effect on the world we live in today. Getting rid of those movements for social and economic justice, that helped create this kind of globalization we have now, one that often puts corporations and profits ahead of human rights.
It's almost like the violence of the Cold War. It's still with us, like a shadow. It shaped the world politically and economically, and we're only starting to really see how.
Exactly. And it makes you ask some really uncomfortable questions about, what they call the American century and this whole story about progress and prosperity. What did that really cost?
So, where do we go from here? I mean, understanding the Jakarta Method, seeing how far its impact reaches, how does that change how we see things like globalization, economic inequality, the U.S.'s role in the world, all that?
It's a question we really have to grapple with, Bevins argues that when these other ways of doing things, these alternative political and economic models were crushed in the global south, it directly shaped the world we live in now. By getting rid of these movements, pushing for social and economic justice, that kind of cleared the path for the kind of globalization we see today, where, corporate interests and profits often come before human rights.
It's like the violence of the Cold War, it left this huge shadow, and it shaped everything, politically and economically. And we're only just starting to understand how deep it goes.
Yeah, that's it. And it forces us to ask these hard questions about, the American century and that whole story about progress and prosperity. What was the real cost? What did we sacrifice for all that?
So what are we supposed to do with this knowledge? Does Bevins offer any solutions?
Not really easy answers, no. This book, it's more like a call for honesty. We need to understand the past in a more nuanced way, acknowledge those brutal realities that shaped our world.
So it's about challenging those dominant narratives, like we always say,
yeah.
Right? Digging deeper, finding the voices that got silenced, the ones that were pushed to the margins.
Exactly. When we face these uncomfortable truths, that's when we can have real conversations about the present, about the future.
Mhm.
We can ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want to build? One built on violence and oppression, or one that's about justice, equality, respecting human rights?
That's powerful stuff, and it really fits with what we try to do here on the Deep Dive. We're all about questioning assumptions, exploring those hidden stories, empowering ourselves through knowledge.
Knowledge is power, that's for sure. The more we understand the forces that shape the world, the better equipped we are to fight injustice, to create a future that's more fair, more compassionate.
So if you're out there and you want to dig into this history, this stuff that often gets overlooked, you got to check out the Jakarta Method by Vincent Bevins. We'll put a link to buy it in the show notes.
It's a tough read, definitely, but it's so important for anyone who wants to understand the Cold War and how it's still impacting the world today, all these complicated things that came out of it.
And don't forget, subscribe to The Deep Dive for more of these deep dives into all sorts of fascinating topics. We're here to help you make sense of the world, one episode at a time.
That's right. We believe that critical thinking is crucial, especially these days with so much information flying around. Don't just accept what you hear. Question everything, explore. Keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
And please, share this episode with anyone who might be interested in challenging the way they think and getting a deeper understanding of history and how it shapes our world. The more we know, the more we can do to make things better, to build a future that's just and fair for everyone.